Hello and good morning or afternoon. Welcome to Archer's Ask the Expert series. We appreciate all of you that have taken some time to join us, and several of you have joined multiple of our sessions, so welcome, and welcome back to many of you. Today we're going to talk about FAC-008 and really center our conversation around principles for facility ratings. As many of you know, throughout these sessions, our goal is to really have a good dialogue and conversation. Some have already sent some questions in to me, but really we look forward to and encourage all of you to ask questions. You can ask questions a few different ways. You can ask questions by raising your hand by clicking the icon at the bottom, and we can give you the mic and you can ask it live. We can have a good dialogue. If you prefer, you can also just type the Q&A. There's a Q&A button at the bottom. Just click on that, type the question, and we'll answer it live here during our conversation. So my name is Mark Brahmstadt. I'll be facilitating and hosting today. I'll give just a quick overview on Archer and what Archer does, just so that some of you who we may not have worked with or you may not have joined these sessions, you have an idea of Archer. And but very quickly, 2-3 minutes in, we'll get to our introductions of our panelists and move into the conversation and dialogue. So again, thank you for joining. So for those of you that are not familiar and maybe new to Archer, Archer is an organization that has started about, almost 6 years ago now. 6 years ago, 4 partners got together. All 4 of those partners spent a lot of time in the utility space, running large organizations, both in cybersecurity, as well as compliance and operations and planning. So while we work well outside the utility space, our sweet spot and our focus area for today is really obviously in the compliance area in the utility space. Archer has continued to grow over the last 6 years. Beyond the leadership that we have, Archer has spent a lot of time being very thoughtful about who we bring on board. We bring on folks that have deep experience within the utility space, credentialed, and folks have experience outside of the utility space to complement with process, procedures, technology as well. So we've continued to grow over the last 6 years, really exponentially. And to our clients that we work with every day, we thank you. And to some of you, we look forward to working with you in the future. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start with Richard and then go to Jim, and we'll get right to the questions. We're already getting some in, so that's great. We appreciate those coming in so quickly. So Richard, if you want to introduce yourself, and then Jim.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. My name is Richard Shifflett. I'm Archer's O&P practice director. And you might say my power experience began with the U.S. Navy. I was a nuclear mechanic on submarines operating the nuclear propulsion plant. From there, went to college, got my engineering degree, and landed at the Bureau of Reclamation here in the Pacific Northwest, where I worked at the largest generator in North America, the Grand Coulee Dam. Was a senior electrical engineer there and spent 4 years as the compliance manager for both SIP and O&P standards. I then transitioned to the auditor space, specifically the WEC region, as a compliance risk engineer, processing self-reports, mitigation plans, and helped stood up the IRAs, the inherent risk assessment process, and internal controls evaluations being performed at the time. And then took a job as an O&P auditor for WEC, and conducted several audits for utilities in the West, and then moved into the consulting arena. And between utility system efficiencies and Archer now, I've been a consultant since 2016. Jim, your turn.
Thank you, and good morning or afternoon, whatever the case may be. Jim Terpening here. I've had the privilege of working in that industry for a number of years. I spent 35 years in public utility and worked my way through, as most of us have, many different positions. Primarily, though, I worked in the relay and meter technician section for a number of years before being asked to come into the school for the utility there and to actually teach the technicians and the electricians. From there, I had the opportunity to go to the dispatcher's office, worked in the power supply dispatcher center for about 9 or 10 years as a coordinator of projects and the installation of new BES equipment onto that particular utilities system. From there, I retired as the superintendent of operation and maintenance for LA and Orange County. Did that for about 9-10 years. They gave me an opportunity to retire, so I left. They asked me to come back and manage the Y2K program for them for generation. It was one of the better things I got to do. A lot of fun. And then I was asked to come and teach internationally. I've been around mostly in the South Pacific, teaching down in Guam and Micronesia. From there, I got a call from WEC and spent 9 years as an auditor in the WEC section and retired from that. As you can see, I couldn't hold a job. And Archer asked me to come and give him a hand for a couple of years. And so that's basically my background. And this is, I've always enjoyed this industry and hope to enjoy it even some more. Thank you. Mark?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Jim. Richard, maybe before we get to the questions, if you wouldn't take a few minutes and just talk about FAC-008 and maybe set the stage. We've got folks on the line who vary in degrees of expertise, so probably just a little level setting would be good, and then we can get right to the questions. All
righty. Well, if you've been around for a lengthy amount of time, you'll know that FAC-008, as I like to call it, FAC-008, standard has been out since basically the enforcement of all the NERC standards back in 2007. Back then, we had FAC-8 and FAC-9, where they split the methodology between the ratings themselves and the two standards, and then eventually combined those into what we have now as FAC-8. You'll also may realize that NERC has had an emphasis on this standard now in the CMEPs, the Compliance Monitoring and Enforcement Program, for a number of years recently. And of course, this year, FAC-8 is emphasized as part of the risk assessment again. So if you do have upcoming audits, I would highly expect that the region will, as part of its IRA, include at least R6 of FAC-8, which is the facility ratings themselves, and conduct monitoring to ensure that the ratings you have are compliant to your methodologies in R1, 2, and 3. Jim, would you like to add anything?
No, I think that pretty well covers it. Sorry about that, I was on mute.
No worries,
Mark?
No worries. Yeah, well, let's go right to the questions then and start some dialogue. And if in the point where we're answering some of the questions that you've typed in, if there's follow-up, please feel free to add that follow-up and or ask another question at any point. So the first question is, what is the best method to present facility ratings? What is a successful or established method that helps lead auditors through facility ratings?
Good question. With regards to how to present those ratings, of course, we have the RSI as the tool to do that. We have the narrative and then the evidence table. And in the narrative, of course, we want to be able to explain that your facility rating information, well, let's first back up to the fact that under R6, you should suspect that a random sample is going to be conducted of your overall facility ratings. You'll be providing them an overall rating list on a per facility basis. And additionally, the equipment ratings that comprise those facilities, that total inventory of equipment will be random sampled And then the auditors will request from that random sample the source information for each of those equipment from the sample. So when we look at the way to present that to the auditor, you'll be providing the overall facility ratings. And I'm using the capital F facility per the NERC glossary. And a facility, we're referring to all the components that comprise a given facility. So if it's a transmission facility, it will be the terminal equipment and the transmission conductors. If it's a generation facility, it'll be the generator or generators up to and through the generator step-up transformer and the interposing equipment. And you'll have an overall rating we refer to as the facility rating for that given capital F facility. Then there will be the equipment ratings that will be detailed as part of that facility. So in the RSL narrative, you would explain how you demonstrate that to them, whether it's a spreadsheet, some sort of other documentation as to how that's displayed. And that runs the gambit. Some people put their methodology and facility ratings in the same document, primarily the smaller utilities. And larger ones have them as separate documents because of the size, the number of equipment that's in an inventory. Best practice I've seen is that the RSL narrative will explain what the auditor will see when they look at those inventories. And the inventory sheets may have if we're looking at like a spreadsheet, for example, there may be a tab at the beginning that has a blank format of how the following equipment ratings are listed, with explanations pointing off to the columns or other cells that are giving information as part of that spreadsheet as an instruction to the auditor how to read the accompanying tabs in the spreadsheet. The overall facility ratings could be done much in the same manner. If you're using just one document for both, I suggest highlighting or annotating the document with text boxes or what have you to call the auditor's eyes to the specific points that you want to call out for the given requirement in scope. Jim, what do you have to add?
The idea of having the each column for the list that is given is outstanding because the auditor called the auditor's attention to exactly what each cell will represent is a great help to him, and it will also help each of the entities that do perform this to understand exactly what's going into the spreadsheet, as well as it allows the auditor to have a better understanding as he goes through it prior to his random selection. So no, it's very good, Richard. Thank you.
Great, thank you both. Going right to the next question. What is an effective method to designate the point of interconnection per R2? Is it one lines?
That's certainly one method to do that. It may be the best. If we're talking about a fairly low number of facilities and it's consistent across all the facilities, you might be able to simply explain that in the narrative of the standard, where you simply state, for entity ABC, all of our generation facilities have one standard point of interconnection, and it is located at this point for each facility. And you could substitute, justify that with a single line and annotate it accordingly. For entities with multiple facilities that are diverse in their connection points, yeah, I would recommend an annotated single line. If it isn't already clear on the single line, perhaps throwing a text box with an arrow or highlighting in some fashion to call out where the point of interconnection is. Also, it's important to designate where the line of demarcation for ownership is between the GO and the TO. That's not always at the point of interconnection. Jim?
That's very good. The dead end structures or the jumper loops to the dead end structures or whatever the point of jurisdiction is not always the ownership. That's a very important part to remember. The as well as listing on the single line or in a narrative of exactly where especially in the case of generation, to know exactly where the point of ownership, owner of jurisdiction changes either in a diagram or in a like Richard said in a note there for the auditor, so he doesn't have to guess or nor will he have to ask you at audit where that point is. So very good. Thank you, Mark.
Very good, thank you. When equipment rating information is requested by the auditor and the rating is based upon a national standard, should we include a copy of the national standard with the response?
So I think an example of that would be, let's say I've got a, I'm thinking of a component type. Let's say we've got a substation bus, like tubular bus structure, and the rating of that bus structure is based on an IEEE standard, let's say. And so the entity explains in the methodology that they're using this IEEE standard, and they include the assumptions, of course, that they use to base that rating upon. If that comes up as part of my random sample, I would expect that the entity would provide me, not necessarily the standard itself, but the analysis that went into determining what that MVA rating of the bus ended up being. That way we can verify that you use the assumptions you stated in the methodology, whether it be ambient temperature, solar radiation, wind cross-section, et cetera, as your value, as the values inputted into calculations from the national standard. So to sum that up, no, I wouldn't expect to see the standard itself, but I would expect to see the calculation sheet or some other evidence used reflecting what the national standard required. Jim?
A reference to the national standard is also a very awesome thing to have for this. But Richard is right. The random selection of your equipment for FAC-008 will undoubtedly bring up a bus or something similar to that. So the size of the conductor, all of that is very important. And then the analysis that went through to determine the value of that bus work. It's nice if you have it there, the auditor doesn't have to ask for it as part of how you determine what the value of in the case that we're talking about, the bus and what it's good for. So no, I totally agree, Richard. Way to go. Mark?
Very good. Next question. How do you recommend addressing where the point of ownership is not the point of interconnection? The ownership stops before the interconnection, but the requirement is all the way to the point of interconnection.
I'm glad the question's brought up. This is something I've seen that gets confused with generation utilities, the GOs that are responsible for compliance to R1 and R2 of the standard. So if you'll recall, R1 is specific to the generation piece up to and including either the low side or the high side of the generator step-up transformer, depending upon who owns the transformer. And this gets to the question of point of ownership. So either in the narrative or through a drawing, you would indicate for a given generation facility where that ownership point is located. Then comes the R2 piece. If the point of interconnection is beyond the point of ownership, or the point of interconnection is beyond the high side of the generator step-up transformer, that's where R2 comes in. And if the generation owner does not own any equipment beyond that point of ownership at the GSU, then really R2 doesn't apply to you, because your TO then must own that equipment going out. And if you look at the language for R2, it's specific to the point from are one stops, that's a generation piece, and out to the point of interconnection with the TO, which may be to a substation bus distinct from the generation facility. So in that case, it's important to document, first of all, who owns the generator step-up transformer, and then where the point of interconnection with the TO is, to determine whether or not A, R2 is applicable to you as a generator owner, and if it is, B, what equipment must be identified for rating per R2's methodology that you have to come up with. So I would expect that to be, it can be documented in the narrative of the RSA itself, or through the single lines like we've talked about before, where you annotate ownership demarcation points and or the point of interconnection with the TO and where their responsibility begins. Did I miss anything, Jim?
No, I think you covered that very well. The idea of a drawing showing jurisdiction or ownership in and jurisdiction limitations would be paramount for the auditor. Very good, very well put. Mark?
Very good. Let's see, got a few more in here. What is, let's go with this one. What is your position on using manufacturer data for all components within a piece of equipment purchased from a manufacturer? For instance, a GSU with internal CTs are given a rating per the manufacturer. Do you feel it is required for us to test those CTs and rate them individually, or can the rating by the manufacturer suffice?
This is a common question with regards to components that are within components. As the example states, you may have a piece of equipment like a GSU transformer, the GSU being generator step-up transformer, that has current transformers built into it. And the manufacturer, of course, of the transformer builds those into the device. And the nameplate provides the ratings of the transformer and gives the current transformer ratios that are available for tapping. I've seen entities approach this two different ways. Either A, they list the generator step-up transformer separate from the CTs in their facility ratings and give ratings for both, essentially based on the nameplate of the transformer. You can use IEEE standards to rate a transformer, but generally, in most situations I've seen, not all, they'll use the manufacturer's nameplate. The other way to do that is that the methodology is written such that components that are an intrinsic part of these major components, such as circuit breakers and transformers, these built-in components like current transformers take on the overall rating of the parent device. So you may write it such in your methodology that current transformers that are intrinsic part of a built transformer are not individually rated from the transformer itself, since the manufacturer designed those current transformers to operate within all operating conditions and limitations of the transformer itself. So they are not individually rated from the transformer. So you'll have one rating for the transformer that encompasses its current transformers built in. And I've seen the same thing for like circuit breakers as well. Jim?
That's right. The individual, in the case of the current transformer, is normally, not normally, the manufacturers will rate those to handle the maximum current that the device is worth, be it a step-up transformer or be it a generator step-up transformer, I'm sorry, or a circuit breaker. So listing them either way, but I've seen it both ways. So just so that it is clear in the documentation and the evidence that's presented of exactly the methodology that was followed, either to include or not include the CTs in that equipment. So very good. Mark?
Or I would like to add that in the case where you have standalone instrument transformers, whether it's a CT or a PT, those of course are not intrinsic to another piece of equipment, and they would have to have a rating. And typically we see manufacturer's data, i.e. the nameplate, used in those cases.
Yeah, exactly right. Good point, Richard.
Great. Next question. Should we be conducting substation walkdowns to verify that what's in our documentation is accurate?
Interesting question. I understand that some regions like to do site visits with respect to FAC-008, where they will request a tour of a given substation or could be generation facility, and they'll walk down the equipment and compare that to perhaps a single line drawing and your facility ratings to ensure that everything is accommodated. Typically, when we talk to internal controls related to FAC-008, we like to recommend that an entity have some sort of review process, not necessarily that you review all equipment ratings, especially if you have a large inventory, but at least do little bites and chunks during a given period of time, such that over a period of years, you may eventually get where you've touched on every given facility and you've reviewed those to verify that your facility ratings are correct. Especially in larger entities where there's a lot of things going on and equipment gets changed out, replaced, or new facilities are added, there's the potential, because we are humans, to miss rating that equipment, or perhaps we rated it, but it didn't get put into a database or a spreadsheet, or maybe even a fat-fingered typing on a keyboard put the rating in wrong. So, you know, those human errors can sometimes crop up, and it's good to do a review at some point such that those little issues are caught. What do you think, Jim?
That's so correct. So many entities have facilities that are constantly in flux, especially when you have a high growth entity where the growth is going forth and you see new equipment expanding lengths of buses or circuits in and out of the facility, or in the case of just time and age where equipment is changed, it's amazing how quickly it is to have things such as disconnects be upgraded from one value to another value and somehow slip through the crack. So it's a paramount of importance that the responsible entities that are preparing for the audit for FAC-008, especially in those regions where they're going to do walkdowns, that they that prior to the audit period, that and possibly at every turn, be sure that the equipment is reviewed, especially after a completed project in the field. These things change really fast, and it's difficult at times to keep up with it. But as a rule, there is some lead individual that is monitoring outages or monitoring equipment changes, and with his help, we can have personnel that can track that so that this equipment doesn't, as it changes, is also changed in the database. So Richard's right. It's a walk down is not a bad idea.
Great, thank you very much. For a facility that is owned in part by another utility, how much information is needed from the other utility, and do we need to show that at audit?
This gets into those cases where you have joint ownership of a given capital S facility. Primarily, we see this in transmission side, where you have a transmission line, it terminates at one entity and terminates at another, and so you have joint ownership of either terminal of the transmission facility. it's important to know what the facility rating is, of course, of that facility, and what the most limiting factor is per the standard to be compliant. And of course, you'll know your own equipment and have rated it as such. But it is especially important that you know what the other entity's side of that is. At the very least, you should at least know what they're rating that facility at and what their most limiting factor is. Best practice would be to have a capture of all the equipment that comprises that facility from your neighbor. But we understand that it would be perhaps overkill depending upon your situation. But in order to sufficiently rate a facility, you've got to have that information to be able to provide a facility rating, and then that, of course, maps into your system operating limits and base case information. Jim?
That's very true. To go right along with that, though, is one of the things that can possibly happen to an entity is in the process of moving from one configuration within the system to another configuration within the system. As you transition from one to the other, keeping the database up as to what is the most limiting factor during this transition period is something that it's trackable, but it is also can be a little bit difficult to keep in mind as you're going from one type of a construction to a second type of construction or configuration, if you please, in the system itself, and the equipment that is being used in the different phases of that project. It has to be tracked so that we know what the most limiting factor is during all of those operations. And when the facility has been modified to its final stage, then that all of the new equipment or updated equipment is taken care of in the database and then made available for the entity to demonstrate compliance. Mark?
Thank you, Jim. And Richard and Jim, I'm going to circle back. There was a follow-up question to the one just prior. So I'll read that, but this is a follow-up / clarification. So just to be clear, if an entity clearly explains this is in the methodology that the CT is part of the GSU, if this is not clearly stated in your FRM, the auditors can place a PNC. Do you recommend that all CTs are listed in Cascade, including the ones included in the GSUs? Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand. For the audience's benefit, FRM is the facility rating methodology, and PNC, of course, is the possible non-compliance. And then Cascade is one of many different tools out there used to track maintenance and information of assets. So to basically restate the question, I think Sarah is asking that if an entity explains in their methodology the CT is part of the generator step-up transformer, do you need to recommend, or do you recommend that all CTs are listed in your maintenance database, including the ones in the GSUs? So if, basically your facility ratings are generated based upon your methodology. Your methodology is your process for determining those ratings, if you will. So if your methodology clearly indicates that CTs that are an intrinsic part of another piece of equipment, such as a transformer or circuit breaker, are not included in your facility ratings because they take on the same rating as the parent device, I would not expect to see those demonstrated in your equipment ratings at audit. However, if that distinction is not made in the methodology, I would expect to see current transformers listed within your equipment ratings to ensure that those were considered when determining the most limiting factor for a given facility. Hopefully I've answered that question to your satisfaction. If not, let us know.
Very good. Thanks for circling back on that one. A couple more questions. So if I'll go through these, I think we got about 3 more questions. So for those of you that just joined, if you missed my opening statements, feel free at the bottom of your screen to click the Q&A or even raise your hand and ask the question live, and we still have plenty of time. So let's go to, for a utility registered as a GO, but not a TO, and has the demarcation or jurisdiction point with the TO at a breaker on the high side of the GSU transformer, is a facility rating methodology for R2 still required?
The short answer is yes. Unfortunately, even though this particular situation, it sounds like the GO only owns a little bit beyond this GSU transformer. Let's see, I think we stated that there was a breaker on the high side of the GSU. So if you recall, R2 begins where the at the point at the GSU, whether high side or low side, depending upon who owns the GSU, out to the TO's demarcation point. And if that's just a few components out, the GO owns those few components and maybe the breaker that was just referenced in the question. So an R2 methodology would be required there, and we would expect to see facility ratings generated based upon that methodology. Jim, do you see it any differently?
Oh, no. If it's the, I've seen it all ways, Richard. The point of jurisdiction ownership changes at the high side of the bushings of the GSU, and sometimes it goes to the breaker. It can be any place that you just spoke to. So I don't have any. No, I think that's a good answer. Thanks.
Very good. Next question. For protection relays, may we exclude protection relay settings based on PRC 23 and PRC 25 compliance?
Oh, yes. I've seen methodologies that leverage these two standards, but you have to be careful. If for the audience's reference, PRC 23 is for transmission, although there can be generation applicability. Relay settings must be set according to PRC 23 if they have settings based on loadability. In other words, they could impact the system's ability to carry load. We're talking about elements that affect facility ratings, of course, too, because if a relay setting is set too low, it can cause a relay to trip, and that would interrupt the power flow and perhaps at a point that would be below your facility rating. So we want to make sure these settings of relays do not impact your facility ratings or become a limiting factor, if you will. So PRC 23, the criteria therein, and PRC 25 for generation relays are such that the requirements of those standards are high enough that they should never impact a facility rating. Knowing that, the piece to be careful here is that PRC 23 is generally applicable to transmission that's 200 kV or above. This leaves a compliance gap for components below 200 kV. So if you have, say, 115 kV transmission, and you're relying on PRC 23 to exclude relays from your facility ratings, there's a compliance gap there. So if say your facility rating methodology stated, because we use PRC 23 and 25 to ensure protection relays do not impact our facility ratings, I would follow up with a question or a data request and say, well, what do you do for your facilities that are below 200 kV that PRC 23 does not address? You could, however, possibly apply PRC 23 to those lower voltage systems. Not that they have to be compliant to PRC 23 necessarily, but you could, as part of your methodology, go ahead and rate them accordingly and ensure that they do not impact loadability because they are compliant to PRC 23 and state so in your facility rating methodology. Otherwise, I would expect to see in your equipment rating lists the facility's protective relay settings for those facilities that are not in the applicability for PRC 23 and PRC 25. Lacking the leverage of those two standards, I would expect to see all protection relay settings included in the equipment ratings that impact loadability at least. What do you think, Jim?
Well, I can't add much to that. That's perfect. Very good. That's a good answer. Mark?
Very good. We're down to our last couple questions, so if there's any more, please feel free to type them in. Do we need to account for current transformers in our methodology and ratings that are built into equipment such as power transformers and circuit breakers?
I think we've pretty much answered that question.
Yep.
When we go to another?
Sure.
If that's not clear, be sure to point it out.
Very good. Thank you. I thought we did, but I didn't want to leave it unasked. Do shunt capacitors need to be part of the facility rating since they are not in series with the power flow?
Yeah, this gets to the question of whether or not to use or include reactive compensation devices in the facility ratings. So let us say we've got a shunt capacitor bank or a shunt reactor. These are not in the power stream per se. They're tap off of a given transmission system. So they do not directly, they're not directly in the power flow, if you will. However, they do impact it. They are providing megavars or reactive compensation, if you will. And they have typically disconnects and breakers associated with them to isolate them for maintenance and use. There may be protection associated with those. Thus, you might have instrument transformers as well. And so we like to look at these as an individual facility, capital F facility, if you will, as part of your system to ensure that those inline components are accounted for to determine the most limiting factor of that facility. So if I have a given, let's say I've got a reactor, a shunt reactor that has disconnect and a breaker with some protection and instrument transformers, I would expect to see an overall facility rating of that reactive compensation device. And then in your equipment ratings, the individual components accommodated for to identify what the most limiting factor is. What do you think, Jim?
Yes, as we get more and more of these shunt compensation, it's important that we know the value of the equipment that is connecting the equipment to the, we'll call it the primary line source, that we do not cause ourselves to find a most limiting factor to be in that type of equipment. So I agree. This is a good comment, Richard.
Very good. Follow-up question here. Have you noticed different regions auditing FAC-008 differently, or have the regions been pretty consistent?
That's a good question. As I presented in my bio at the beginning, I was a WEC auditor, and so I'm knowledgeable in the way WEC's audit approach is used. But as a consultant, I've been through several regions here in North America, and I have seen some differences with respect. For example, I mentioned in one region they were doing site visits to walk through a given substation or generation facility to compare the facility ratings to the equipment that they could physically see or touch, although not necessarily that you want to touch some of that. But with regards to the data that's expected, of course, I think they're pretty consistent with regards to the audit approach that's listed in the RSAW. You've got the compliance assessment approach table there as your cheat sheet to know what the auditor is going to look for, and they will all pretty much follow that. But the level of detail that they dive into may vary region to region. I personally have not seen a lot of distinction there. And knowing that the FAC-008 standard is part of this NERC CMAP for the last few years, and the audit scopes have been narrowed because of the risk-based approach, the auditors have been diving deeper into these standards, and FAC-008, of course, is one of those. So if you haven't had an audit in a while, I would recommend you would expect to see a deeper dive into the facility rating information and or other aspects of FAC-008. What's your experience, Jim?
That's very true. This FAC-008 is becoming a more intense audit point. They're similar, but they're dissimilar. That's you like that oxymoron? There are some that dive a little deeper than others, but they all get to the same point at some time. In the fact that they want to know the most limiting facility of the property, and they want to verify that the equipment is as stated by the utility or the entity itself. And each region is a little different, but they're basically all the same. They get to the end point in different fashions, but they get there to show that there is compliance with this particular standard. So it's good. Yeah, just beware. Mark?
Wonderful. Well, thank you. That was actually our last question. So what I'd like to do
we got one more, Mark.
Oh, we did. Just under the wire, huh? There we go. Have you seen a GO or TO successfully get through an audit with no findings when the POI could not be clearly identified? If so, how was this managed?
I've yet to run into a case where the point of interconnection wasn't specified, but I'm trying to think of a situation that might be the case. But generally, when we have a vertically integrated utility where they're both the GO and TO, the point of interconnection is important, and with respect to determining if R2 is applicable to that entity, because they're both a GO and a TO. If the point of interconnection is at the high side of the transformer, then R2 doesn't apply to that utility, just R1 and R3. But in those cases where you're just GO-GOP or just a GO, that point of interconnection is, of course, very important, as well as where the ownership begins with respect to the GSU transformer. If the point of interconnection is not established, I don't know how you would circumvent a possible non-compliance issue, because that helps determine whether or not R2 is applicable to you as a generator owner. Generally, we see these at the high side of the GSU, and the generator owns the GSU transformer. So there is no R2 applicable in that case for the generator owner. But without the distinction made where the point of interconnection is with the TO for their responsibility, it leaves a big gap for the auditor to ask, okay, well, how do you know if R2 is applicable to you or not? And do you have equipment, therefore, that you own that is applicable? Of course, they could come back and say, I guess the best question to follow up was, do you own any equipment beyond the point of the generator step-up transformer? If you do, then clearly the point of interconnection with the transmission owner is some point beyond, and then I would apply R2 in that case. So I still think that it would be very difficult to circumvent a possible non-compliance without that point of interconnection established. What do you think, Jim?
It would be most difficult without the point of interconnection clearly identified. Yeah, I agree, Richard. I don't know what I could add to that. That's it's a point that needs to be established. Mark?
Very good. Thank you. Okay. I think, we've got one more that just came in as well, which is good. This one, will we receive a transcript? So yeah, there will not be a transcript per se, but we are recording every session and posting them out to our website. Give us about 24 hours or so for these to get out to our website. If you go on to archerint.com and click on the events. You can see where all our events are listed, and recordings of past events are there as well. So hopefully that's helpful. And as a follow-up, so I'm going to give Richard and Jim an opportunity here just to maybe talk through anything that they didn't maybe get a question on, or last-minute items they want to give to the audience. If you guys have any follow-up questions, my email address is on the bottom of the screen. Feel free to write it down and email me directly with any follow-up questions that you may have. So Richard, if you want to start, and Jim, and then I'll close out.
Okay. You know, the typical disclaimer you see with some product documentation, you know, your mileage may vary. You know, in the auditing space, auditors come and go. Their knowledge levels vary. FAC-008, of course, is very technical, and you may see mixed results with regards to individual auditors, even in a given region, depending upon who gets assigned this standard. With respect to any future audits you may have, if you've been around this industry for a while, you know, as a different auditor gets assigned to the standard, you may see differences in approach when it comes time for audit. And the level of detail that they go into in their data request and or expected information, of course, would vary. That's all I've got to add. Jim?
In preparing for an audit, and this is not only for FAC-008, and I've said this in other meetings, the auditor themselves of coming into your entity, they're coming into your world for 2 or 3 weeks at the most, and they're learning a new language of what you call different things. Now, NERC has gone out of their way to give us a great glossary of terms to identify the standards and the particular parts of the standards. I highly recommend, in some cases, if you have specialties on how you name or call things, put a glossary of terms in there for the auditors. Give him a heads up. As far as the different types of auditors, I audited for what, 10, 11 years. Auditors come, and they come with much different backgrounds and education, as well as knowledge of the utilities. And in a short period of time, they're trying to learn each entity's during audit period. They're learning their language, learning their system. So I can't emphasize enough single lines and notes, annotations on the single lines on the single lines showing the difference between ownership, jurisdiction, and such as that. It just makes your life a little easier at the end and during the audit. So now this has been I think this has been one of the better calls we've had for standards, and thank you very much for being here. Mark?
Richard and Jim, thank you guys very much. And to our audience, thank you for all the questions and the great virtual conversation. As I mentioned, you can go to the events tab on our website and see everything that's out there. Next week, we've got a session with one of our business partners, Genetec, and we're going to talk about making the change to your physical security systems. So you can register for that on our website, or if you need anything, you can always email me directly. Thank you all for your time, your questions, and we wish you all a great day and a great rest of the week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.